Maryann, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Good to see you too, Seth. Thanks for having me. And thanks for all the work that you and your co-directors are doing at Title Track.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. You've put in so much work through the years. So right back at you, your work is expansive, as an educator and as an activist and writer. Even just as a writer, you're expansive as a playwright and writing essays and articles, and now you've just published your second novel. And
right.
So why don't we start there? You finished Landmarks and you're running a pre-order right now, and you've generously given funds to Title Track from the pre-orders. So thank you so much for that. And I know that Holly Bird was involved a little bit in the process of creating the book as well, my co-executive director.
Right. Yeah, Holly and I had several conversations, especially regarding Indigenous communities, but especially Indigenous women as water protectors. And that was a really important part of it for me, is to make that connection. Whenever my writing is always described as being place-based. And I think that's because for me, the natural world, the more than human world, is just as important, and sometimes even more important than the human characters. So I spend just as much time, I guess, helping a reader just understand and feel and experience a place as I do with the human characters. And, here in the state of Michigan, everywhere around the U.S., everywhere around the globe, there are Indigenous communities that have been caretakers of place for a long, long time. So yeah, Holly, what a bundle of energy and what a, resume of activism she has too. So we spoke quite a bit during the process of my writing.
Yeah.
I wanted to say too, if I might, to explain to people the benefit of a pre-order campaign, because my goal with this novel, with the pre-order campaign, is to highlight the work of some important environmental activist organizations, but also to offer support. So once a book is published and its publication date arrives, mine being April 16, there's no way to really track in any good way where any sales are coming from. So a pre-order campaign, and listeners can find that on my website, on my Facebook site. I'm sure Title Track will announce that. But with a pre-order campaign, it's running through bookshop.org. And Bookshop is an online retailer for independent bookstores. It gives 10% of its profits to independent bookstores. And it's a way that I can actually track what sales come in between this date and that date. And then, of course, turn over, hopefully, that nice bundle of funds to Title Track.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this is a novel, but would it be considered historical fiction because it has its roots in the fracking boom of northern Michigan?
Yeah, it might be considered, because it's recent, it might be considered research-based fiction.
Okay.
Sometimes people call, when a writer writes from direct experience, sometimes they'll call it autobiographical fiction, which sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, but so Landmarks is based on research that I completed, especially what I call 2 years of my boots on well sites research, when I was going around the state of Michigan and visiting every active frack well site in the state. And one of the things that was alarming to me and a lot of people is a lot of the fracking that was happening in our state forests on public land. And it I spent 2 years with the science, um, learning about, the neurotoxins, the carcinogens, the endocrine disruptors, you name it, the chemical cocktail, the risk of earthquakes, the water withdrawals and the excessive water use and abuse. But what started to emerge for me, I was writing articles in places like EcoWatch, kind of get the word out pieces. But what started to become much more important to me were the stories of the people that I was meeting that were living with fracking, people living next to a frack well site, and also just what I might call the sensory story of fracking, what it was like to smell and feel and experience that the drilling and fracking process. So that's about the time I decided I really needed to write a novel. I wanted to do something that would steep the reader in both what fracking, looks, smells, feels like, but also give us all a chance to participate in standing up and saying something when something feels so incredibly wrong.
Beautiful. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for your courage to do that, because I know that a lot of people, they can see that it's wrong, they can see that it's toxic, but they might not know how to take action or feel like they're the kind of person that's an activist. And it can also be really intimidating when you start to get into the weeds and you see the collusion between state and corporate powers. And it's chilling, and
Absolutely.
it's pervasive, and it's a lot to stand up to. And yet, what better way to pass our days than standing up for what we know to be right and know to be true? And what I'm hearing also is there's something really essential about being in right relationship with ourselves here too, where it's like, once you've seen this and you know it to be real, then you have sort of a moral obligation, an ethical imperative to continue on this path of trying to do something about it, or else you can sort of fall out of alignment with your own moral compass.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. That idea of being out of alignment with self. You mentioned the concept of an activist, and that's something that's really important to me in this book. So one of the one-line taglines when you write a novel, you have to come up with these one sentence, two sentence, one paragraph descriptions. And one of those taglines for me is, once you've experienced the devastation of fracking, nothing but stopping it makes sense. And what I really wanted to do with this novel, so the first part of it is called Showing Up, and it follows the narrator. Her name is Rebecca, and she's a college professor, but she has a very active and storied activist past of her own. She has these 4 really interested students, college students, Sonia, Brett, Mark, and Kate, and they start doing research, and she kind of is helping them from a distance, researching, writing. They're doing all these well site visits, which, the autobiographical part for me. But the second part of the novel is called Showdown. And what it is it literally welcomes the reader into an action camp. And I think one of the most important things for me to get across with it, and it kind of encapsulates the activism I saw. I think activism can be intimidating when we think about it as a label. And sometimes we portray and romanticize activists as very special people with some kind of special power. But in Landmarks, some very imperfect but creative locals and a few seasoned activists come together, and whatever they have to offer is what the action needs, whether it's painting some art signs or engaging in a tree sit or a lockdown on a well site, or being part of the content, writing about it, taking pictures. And I really wanted people to understand that, for me at least, there is no special person with special powers. There's just all of us. And there's a place for all of us to do something, so that was really important. And I'll tell you on the idea of collusion, oh my gosh, did I see and experience plenty of that. One of the most memorable events, and it's something that I fictionalized and wrote about in the book, was mineral rights, an oil and gas leasing auction that takes place where members of the oil and gas industry can bid on land that is put up or not, that they nominate that they want to work with. And in the state of Michigan, in roughly about 2012 to 2014, there was a lot of activity and a lot of protest happening at those oil and gas leasing auctions. And the first one that I covered as a writer and experienced, there was a lot of stand-ups, people speaking their mind about how important place and land were them. At the second one, the auction room was surrounded by police officers, and there was a sign that told the public that they were not allowed to speak. So it was just, and I mean, on one functional level, I guess, you're standing in this room where all these bidders are sitting at tables and bidding on land that you live with. No. And then the public was clearly addressed by, you may not speak. If you speak, you will be removed. It's just kind of an interesting, wall. You can watch, but there's nothing you can do about this.
Yes. Yeah, it's bizarre. I've experienced very similar things. It's Orwellian, really. I mean,
Yeah.
A lot of times, even just calling something a public comment session, around the time of the Flint water crisis, which had the parallel just a couple hours west of Flint, was Nestle, stealing billions of gallons of Great Lakes aquifer, water for $200 a year. And when they had the public comment session, it was 99% like, no, you can't do this. But it was theater, really, because they just went ahead and did it anyway. And it's not to say that we can't stand up and make public comment. It's absolutely necessary. And sometimes it does change the course of events. But it can be really deflating when, especially for beginners, for activists who are new to it, to start to realize we're sort of peeling back the onion of democracy and realizing, oh, what's the definition of fascism? It's the merging of state and corporate powers. Is that what I'm seeing here? Yes, it actually is. And so now we have to re-strategize and continue, knocking on the front door, but see what else can be done. And at Title Track, we have a new program called Water Protectors Training Camp for kids, where we talk about different ways to approach long-term movement work. And similar to what you wrote about, it's like, well, we use the butterfly model, which was created by Leah Penniman, wonderful writer and farmer. And so it's like, we need resistors, reformers, we need healers, and we need, resist, reform, heal, and build, and builders. So building new systems, new communication systems. Healers include artists, and we need a lot of imagination and creativity in these movements. And sort of like you said, people need to give themselves permission to use their talents for the cause, and find a way to let go of imposter syndrome. Like, am I an activist or not? Well, I'm not just watching, I'm doing something. And that's all it is, really. That's all activism is is instead of simply bearing witness, you're taking some sort of an action, which, like you said, anyone can do. Everybody can do, and all of us have unique things to bring to the movement. So there's reforming the institutions that we do have, and then there's also building new institutions, and then of course resistance. And there was a lot of resistance from the public in those years.
Mm-hmm.
And they came on strong with a lot of resources, a lot of these landmen coming. I mean, they came to Earthwork Farm and invited
Oh,
themselves to
yes.
my dad's table. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very smooth talkers with great talking points about how much money, these farmers are going to make and how they're not going to have
Mm-hmm.
to do any work and there's going to be no problems. It was like some sort of a utopian dream, like there will be no negative environmental impact. And they actually say this to people.
Right.
And
Right.
you met people who had this experience of landmen coming to them, making these promises, and then it wasn't true, right?
Right. Right. Absolutely. Um, you know, you spoke about meetings, and we've all experienced them in our frustration. And you realize really quick, we called it the safe canning or safe fracking canned presentation, that every public meeting was this, we called it that, as well as a shit show, because you just show up and hear all this, basically why fracking is safe. And no matter who stood up and asked about chemicals or water abuse or the risk of earthquakes, the dialogue with the public was the same, and it was pretty one way. It was pretty outward. Um, I wanted to say something about story too, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to choose Title Track as one of the organizations that I wanted to highlight. Is sometimes I think it helps if we think about the fact that culture is a story. I mean, yes, we have all kinds of institutionalized systems that we need to change, and they move slowly. We have to push from all directions always to keep that change coming. But I think if we think of what anthropologists, or especially, sociologists talk about, is culture as a story. It's a story that we tell ourselves about, how we belong, how we behave.
Mhm.
And that's why I think what you're doing at Title Track, as well as, showing people stories of resistance and how solidarity can be absolutely fun. I mean,
Yeah.
it's energizing. It's fun. It feels good to stand together. But it's a change of story that we're all trying to do. Joanna Macy, when permaculture was first out, Joanna Macy was part of the permaculture's, flower petals, that idea of the great turning, turning away from, the fossil fuel and the petrochemical era. And she talked about that, that need for story. And I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in the climate change realm is maybe about 10, 15 years ago, the sustainability movement really picked up on that idea of we need culture changers, we need story changers, we need to change our story. And most recently, what I'm reading alongside with the climate change report, because there are so many things about climate change and tipping points that are accelerating, they are now listing people like us, people like artists, musicians, writers, people working to change that story. They're calling us change accelerators. It's no longer, just that concept of being a change accelerator. We've
Yeah,
got to speed this up.
that's it. I mean, it's really about culture, because
Mhm.
cultural values shape our entire society. They shape policy, and until we shift cultural values and change what we value, and going back to the beginning of the conversation, indigenous lifeways,
Mhm.
It was all about valuing relationships, gratitude, and reciprocity, and always giving back. And those cultural values work for hundreds of thousands of years. People can live sustainably with those cultural values and those life ways and joyfully and in deep relationship with one another and the earth. And right now, our culture is so upside down in terms of mainstream cultural values. Everything is extractive. It takes without giving anything in return. And so I work in both worlds. You know, I'm a musician
Mhm.
and writer, but then I work in policy and I work with some really gifted and experienced um, policy heads in DC, and they say the same thing, especially where we're at right now. It's like, you know, obviously we're going to work all day on policy, but we need artists. We need these change accelerators. We need these
Mhm.
people who are doing narrative change work in
Mhm.
order for the policies we need to pass. And so, another quote that I heard in the fall at the One Water Summit was, social change moves at the speed of narrative change. So
Yeah.
our story about who we are and what we're doing here is what is going to, you know, be the strong motivation for what we do in the world,
Mhm.
and the impact that we have. So I think it's wonderful, and you're in both worlds too. You're doing this creative writing, but it's all built on 2 years of extensive, voracious research and activism. Um,
Right.
so you did the 2 years. You visited every fracking site, with a focus on the fracking in the state forests, and you created this story with these characters. So I'm curious to know how the characters emerged and how their personalities revealed themselves to you.
Um, a lot of times when I first start writing, I'm it I'm listening to characters, and maybe that's because I started out writing as a playwright. So, characters and what they think and what they say and don't say is the most important thing you do on stage. Um, so Rebecca, the narrator, I mean, obviously she has some strong ties with me. But I also wanted her to be a person who he- has the freedom to maybe be idealistic in what can be accomplished, and also has the anger in a positive way and the energy to keep going. Um, but she was also a bit like me in that she's a teacher. And one of the things that happens when you teach is y- you're there to facilitate each student's growth, but you have to be careful about influence. I'm not, even when I teach an eco-lit and activism class, we may be looking at the history of the environmental movement and the writing that helps people, understand and activate. But I don't want to tell anybody how to think and feel. I want them to, walk into that on their own. Um, so it's an experience that I've had as an observer, as a writer of actions, direct actions, things happening. Um, that's an interesting conundrum, and sometimes it's a little bit painful to just want to be that person who stands up and says no more, and rushes the drill rig yourself. But you've got to keep writing. Um, the characters then, the college student characters, are really kind of an amalgamation of what I see in young people, and these characters are in their 20s. And one of the things that sometimes in the public, younger people are presented, especially the 20 somethings, as apathetic. But what I wanted people to understand is maybe they're experiencing eco grief and eco anxiety. Um, One of my former students, who is a singer songwriter, she and I were presenting at the same environmental conference. And I'll never forget how she started her set. I was presenting something called Fracking in the Forest, where I was showing pictures of well sites, describing all the science and also delivering some poetry in between. And she was singing, and she had these beautiful songs that were inspired by, kind of women of science and nature. And she swung her guitar out of the case and across her lap, and she introduced herself like this. She said, "Hi, I'm from the generation that's been told we're screwed since 5th grade." And that just hit me. It's like, and she started talking about ever since we learned about the water cycle or climate change, we've been told it's too big, it's over, there's nothing you can do. As far as that messaging that climate change is, the ball is rolling, it's too late. And so I wanted to give people like her, that character, their chance to do something, to say, I get that things are dire. I understand the science and the tipping points. I understand that we've gone way beyond 350 as far as carbon in the atmosphere now, but I still want something to do. I need some hope. I need something to do. I want to have a role instead of, you're screwed. So.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That reminds me of this moment at this men's retreat that I hosted last month, where we honored the elders that were there, and there were a number of guys in their 60s and 70s. And then we honored the young men that were there, and there were a couple guys in their 20s. And it was such a shock to some of the elders to hear the truth from the youngest men there about the way they see the future and sort of what they feel that they've inherited from their generation. And like you said, from a very young age. And not only is there this eco catastrophe, but it's a confluence of crises, some of which the elders don't fully understand because they didn't grow up with it, like AI and social media. They're not immersed in it in the same way that young people are. So it's really important to me and to Title Track to reach these folks, because not only do they have the awareness of what's going on, but they also are like there's a culture of empathy and support amongst young people that's stronger than it was when I was a kid. And it's a really beautiful thing to witness in organizing, because organizing is hard and infighting is very, very common in activism. And part of that is just that we're doing activism because we feel moved to say no to something horrible that's happening or is about to happen. And it's very stressful, and there's a lot of grief. And there aren't that many eco psychologists out there. It'd be great if all of us had a personal one,
Right.
But within movement work, we're all carrying a big load and a lot of stress, and we don't know if it's going to go the way we want, but we're dedicating ourselves to it. And sometimes we end up taking out our frustration on the people that we have access to, the people that we're closest to.
Right.
But I'm finding that younger people are doing less of this. At least that's my perception. And they're just tremendously valuable to the movement. And yet it can be that razor. There's just a very thin line between it's not worth it and I can do this, or I'm not an activist. I wish you all the best. Like, some people say that to me, even today on social media. I had someone comment on one of my posts, "I really hope you guys win this." It's like, well, we're not going to win it without you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
it's so close. Some people are just, and I try to be optimistic. People are so close to being onboarded into not just the work, but the community. And you started to talk about how fun it is. I mean, these are our people. You look around and it's like, it moves you to see the people that you're doing movement work with on a daily basis. I just came out of a Title Track staff meeting right before our interview. And I feel that every Wednesday when I'm on a Title Track staff meeting, these people care. and they're putting their lives to work for the common good. And also we have a lot of fun. We have like a Slack channel for jokes, and we try to bring songs into our meetings and our retreats. And so that the creative, imagination and spontaneity is so important to long-term movement work as well. But it's just a very interesting time to be doing intergenerational movement work. And I learn a lot from all the generations. But I think it's very important, partly because there's such a crisis of isolation for everyone in our culture. I think it's really important to have intergenerational movement work happening, because we really do learn from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly, the pandemic didn't do any of us any favors in terms of isolation, and that consumeristic, productivity driven, extractive economy kind of cultural story is very isolating.
Yes.
It makes people feel alone regularly in everything they do, whether it's, they can't do enough at work, or they can't be, a super parent plus worker plus, what, you name it. But it's really interesting. I do see that, that intergenerational bringing together is so important. And, yeah, the young people that I know, the students that I have in classes, it's been amazing to me, like in an environmental literature class. One of the things that I start the class out with now when I teach it, beyond teaching creative writing and other forms of research writing, is I start my eco-lit classes out with an eco-grief index. It's like a survey. Where do you fall? And it's amazing how fast students will just pour into that process. And I don't know if they've ever been invited to do that. And another thing I'll say, okay, so what do you want your future to look like? Mm-hmm. And even in the educational realm, we don't often position students to think of, what do you want the future to be like? Like, if you wake up in a future that feels right to you, that looks good, that you move through in the way that you want to, that you're doing the kind of work you want to, what does it look like? So I do a lot of just kind of what you might call visioning or imaginative work. And even in the educational realm, we put out all these surveys that say, here's what career fields are going to be big in the next 10 or 20 years, and here's where you can fit yourself into. And I understand that from a broad, needs base, but also inviting people into the idea that we can make the future. It's not some preset, it's not a preset picture. I mean, we have some factors we got to work on for sure. Many. But we make the future.
Yes. Beautiful. I'm so curious. I love what you said about the responsibility, the power that teachers have, mm-hmm. and how important it is to be cognizant of that. But I'm so curious to know, like, if I was in Maryann's creative writing class, like, how you would help me unlock my creativity. Like, what are some of the things you say on the first day to these folks?
First day thing that I say all the time in creative writing is you have to be the strongest you that you can be. That trying to mimic somebody else, trying to create some formula for creation that's going to sell your story, isn't going to work, because it's not going to be authentic. You have to be the strongest you that you can be. And there's a saying that I take from a former writer mentor of mine. Her name is Sina Jeter Naslund. She's a pretty widely published author who works pretty much with historical fiction. And she says we reach the universal through the particular.
Mm.
So we don't become universal by trying to sound, act, look like everybody else, or trying to guess what somebody else wants from us. We become universal when we are being our kind of presenting our own particular outlook and experience in a way that somebody else picks up on and can then kind of participate and commune with that, because it's like, yeah, not that I've had that exact experience, but I know what it's like to feel that deeply about something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a couple of my starting points. And usually with creative writing, I mean, students know that I'm a playwright, a novelist. I joke with them that I write really bad poetry, because every time I try to write a poem, it turns out to be some dramatic monologue instead. But I don't openly share a lot of my work with students unless they directly ask me to.
Mm.
Just because I don't even want to be an influence. It's like, don't think you have to write like me to reach me. Write like you. What do you have to say?
Beautiful. Yeah, there's so much comparison in the industries of creativity
Mhm.
and in social media in general. So
Mhm.
it's great to have, and I have to do this. I mean, 20 years into my career as a professional songwriter, just to try to summon the best that I can do for myself and not compare myself to other songwriters who are already out
Mhm.
there. They've already written their songs. Um, so it really is like the best that I can be of myself, uniquely me. Um,
Mhm.
what do you say to your students about writer's block or perceived writer's block if they feel stuck or they can't come up with anything creative?
I usually talk to them about that, like the critic on your shoulder, or that idea that you have to be productive.
Mm,
Um, for me, at least, a lot of writing, like even when I'm working on a novel, I may be just, sitting with a cup of coffee, hopefully outdoors or close to the outdoor world, and just journaling. And I don't stamp a lot of uh I guess expectation on that kind of work. Um, and I try to help students think about that. The other thing I do is I put them into what I call writing activities all the time. It's like I'll have them do something, respond to something, write. It sounds corny. It's not really like a prompt, but more um, like, let's say we're talking about book banning, something that's on the uptick, um, unfortunately. And I'll talk about, what have you been banned from saying? When have you ever felt banned, like you couldn't talk? And I'll say, nobody's going to read this. Nobody needs to hear it, but let it fly. When
mm,
have you been banned? When has your voice been silenced in some way, however it was? And so usually I just try to reconnect them to the idea that when we're writing and creating, usually it's our own personal experience or something we're moving through the world and trying to understand that is inspiring us. So we don't have to feel so heavy handed on ourselves. We can think about the whole world as, our creative soup. And just by interacting with those ideas, that's writing, that's creating. And it doesn't have to be pretty at first either. It can be raw and messy and, go through 5 or 6 iterations before you know what it really is. But
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. Wow, I love that prompt. I might have to run
Yeah.
with that after this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It'd be
I
great.
could feel that. It's
Yeah. It'd be
beautiful.
great and it's that kind of thing, the kind of thing where, for me, that sense of being present, for me, it takes shape as being present to place when I'm outdoors in the natural world where I love to be. That's probably my strongest spiritual connection, is just being in the natural world and being present to that. but you can also be present to your own body and mind as you move through a day. And that's very creative, interacting with what it feels like to experience. But yeah, the banning one, that's an important one right now. And it has resulted in a lot of sometimes poetry has a real strong activist, social justice, something to say tendency. So, that one's good for that.
It sure is. I know a number of folks who became activists through slam poetry. They found an outlet to express themselves. They met other poets, many of whom were activists, and using that medium to vent about activism is super powerful.
Yeah, the spoken word is so. I think what's great about spoken word is that you are the exact opposite of what we're sometimes, I guess, advised to do, is be more objective when you go out and present to the world. And I don't really mean objective. I mean, maybe just pull back a little, let your work stand out there for itself. But with spoken word, it is so sensory because somebody's entire body can get involved in how they're making sound, how they're dramatizing words. And that can be really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned being place-based or considered place-based. Your first novel is called Base 10, and that was also based in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. So in Base 10, the main characters, there's two women who have been friends from college years throughout their life. They're both researching astronomers. One of them continued on a strong research path. The other one, based on having children and a family, made some decisions to make her family and her work together. But she's the novel starts out at a point where she feels like she's been away from her stars for too long. I mean, she's an astronomer who wants to be out there, wants to be doing this research. And so she actually takes a 10-day solo camping trip basically in and around the Nordhaus Dunes, the West Michigan Manistee National Forest and the Nordhaus Dunes area between Ludington and Manistee. And she's out there just trying to, reclaim herself, trying to figure out, okay, my children are, I've raised them pretty much. They're not adults yet, but how do I model to them that I can be a parent, but I can still have all of these other things that I need to be me still too? So there's just a whole lot of the big lake, the dunes, the forest. Yeah. One of my favorite places in the world to just be. So it takes place there.
Beautiful. Yeah. I love Nordhaus.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people, it's funny when I first started, it's definitely been one of those places that's become more and more known. It reminds me of when, I don't know how many years ago, on the news, the Sleeping Bear Dunes became announced as one of the 10 most beautiful places in the US. And, a place like Empire is suddenly inundated with tourists and travelers. Nordhaus is a little bit like that, where I can remember years ago, strapping everything on your back and walking out there, maybe not in the peak season, but, and not necessarily encountering another human for a few miles. But yeah, we share it with a lot of people now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's going to be increasingly that way in both in the years to come. So fracking, we're past the boom in Michigan. I'd love to just hear from you what you see, sort of from when you did that research, the boots on the well sites, to where we are now in terms of the threat of fracking in Michigan?
Well, I think the threat is not gone by any means. In fact, there are projects going on. One of the most recent ones, and I don't have a lot of deep research about that, but there was a former kind of pipeline to a Mexican a facility in Mexico for processing natural gas and shipping it up to the U.S. And I believe they're talking about reversing that direction now. That idea of if in the future we had a lot of policy making and decision makers that decided, so-called unconventional fossil fuel methods, we were going to open the door back up, increase tar sands production, increase fracking, liquid natural gas exports. Under the right future policy and decision making, we could see a great increase in that. The oil and gas industry, as you know, as lots of Michiganders know, has already been here. They've tested out certain geological layers. They've leased a lot of state forest land, millions of acres. And, under the right welcoming committee, whether that's state or federal, it's certainly not gone. It's not gone away. And then there's, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, while this was happening, there was a movement to ban fracking altogether in Michigan, which
Right.
didn't happen.
It did not happen. It met many roadblocks as far as getting a ballot question on the ballot for the voters. But oh my gosh, we're activists and again, everyday people just doing their part. One of the ways I walked into the more public version of doing this kind of activism was when Berry County, at the time I was living in Wayland, which is in Allegan County, very close to Berry County. In Berry County, 24,000 acres of Berry County's state land was nominated for oil and gas leasing and put up for auction. Almost all of the acreage in the county. And people responded. They first questioned, wait a minute, this is public land. How can that happen? So learning about that process. But there is an environmental education center called Circle Pines, where a lot of people know it as the place where Buttermilk Jamboree takes place. And Circle Pines kind of opened its door for people to meet and start talking about this and think about how can we all work together. And, from doctors to lawyers to musicians to artists to water well drillers to farmers, people just showed up around the Circle Pines table and started talking, well, what can we do? And part of that was the ban effort. And the people in Berry County, as well as a few other counties around Michigan, were really responsible for educating the public about what fracking was. I mean, they showed up and just kept showing up. They took my pictures of frack well sites and went to all these meetings and circulated ban petitions and just talked to people about here's what this process is. Because at that time, very few people knew that fracking was actually happening in Michigan. It's not something, talk about collusion or other, forces of government, state, corporate, working together. One of the things that I found out that was absolutely, kind of jaw-dropping was when an oil and gas industry applies for a permit to, for instance, drill and frack, they don't even have to tell the public about it. There's a confidential status they can get where that can be done without any public knowledge for a certain amount of time. which is crazy making to think about. You're
Yeah.
talking about leased public land,
Yeah.
and then the public doesn't even have a right to know about it until after it has happened.
People should be angry about that.
Yes.
This
Yeah.
is this is the commons. This is what we
Yeah.
hold in common. It's state land. Our tax dollars go toward protecting it.
Mhm.
Yeah. it-
Yeah.
It's wrong.
But yeah, just the everyday add-in of people doing their part. And like I said
Yeah.
before, that's one thing I wanted to put in the novel. These people aren't perfect. Rebecca, the narrator, isn't perfect, Um, nobody shows up and has all the perfect talents that, we're not superheroes. We
Mhm.
are exhaustible. The Justice League of superheroes never gets tired, right? They can just always be called up for another mission. Um, but in real life, we get tired. But if we're deep enough, if there's enough of us, then we can just kind of keep, moving to the front of the line or sagging back sometimes, coming back up to the front.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so much negative propaganda gets hurled at activists. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, it's usually a lot of people, like you said, who are citizens who have nothing to gain from their activism. And they're saying no to something that is all about personal gain at the expense of the common good.
Right.
And so I
Right.
always push back hard when people have this preconception of like righteous, entitled, or like, I mean, sure, there are those, especially in the elite ruling class, who will sort of treat activism as a trend for them to sort of advance their own personal interests or their political careers. But when we're
Right.
talking about movements from the ground up, these are, I mean, in my adult life, I have met hundreds of people that I adore and love and respect and learn from in these settings. And these are people who have nothing to gain personally. And I think it's really a powerful thing, just the act of standing up to
Mm-hmm.
big energy, to big government, to
Mm-hmm.
just that act of trying. And then it's interesting, over the years, some of the people that you met through a movement, like for me, we stood up to the Kennecott mine, Rio Tinto's
Mm-hmm.
Kennecott mine, the metallic sulfide mining. Um, and it was a horrific idea, and thousands of people stood up, and for years we stood up against it, and they pushed it through anyway. But was that, would I go back and do it again? Of course. Was it a
Mm-hmm.
loss? No, because all of these relationships were built. Many of these organizations didn't know each other until they started working on this campaign. There were all of these folks who didn't even know the tribes in the UP until
Right.
this campaign, and there was indigenous leadership at the center. So when we do movement work, we're practicing movement work. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's that practice of devotion without attachment to a specific outcome, and then doing it again and again and again. And so all of that work we did to stand up to Kennecott is relevant as we stand up to the Copperwood mine or the Tilden mine expansion, and
Mm-hmm.
that's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this work in those years standing up to fracking, all those relationships um, are precious and very relevant to this ongoing work. And I think it's liberation work. It's work for, um, when we're standing up for the water and the land, we're standing up for our own right to be free, and for our children to have the basic necessities. But it's also our relationship with nature, and how humans have grossly abused the power that we have over other living things for far too long. And particularly since colonialism, the Western powers that have colonized the world, they did it in a way that was terribly extractive, and
Mm-hmm.
it was about dominion, and it was
Mm-hmm.
not about relationship. And so, there's a lot of healing that we have to do. And as recovering settlers ourselves, as white folks in Michigan, there's a lot of healing and atonement and recovery. It's recovery work in some ways for me. as I sort of readjust my worldview. But just the act of standing up in itself, it is sort of an act of like agency over one's own personal liberation. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. When you mentioned, of course, the history of, when we look at place, Rebecca, the narrator, which is something that I work with all the time, there's a passage where she's thinking about this, where, who am I to stand up and talk about place when we have this history of, removing people from their place, the treatment of indigenous communities, but also just the fact that, throughout our oil and gas history, a lot of, oil and gas development, refineries, where these things were placed were usually in indigenous, Black communities, communities of color, or places that are suffering from poverty. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of acknowledging that injustice and making sure that we're working on it all the time. I'm reminded of, I believe it was Delita Smith, a member of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, who said there was a indigenous panel of 5 women, and Holly Bird was actually on that panel. And it was about looking at Line 5, the tar sands pipeline in indigenous communities and how they are in the forefront of working against that. Line 3 also. And she said something about the concept of land ownership and how oil and gas leasing is done. And she said, how can we permit what we don't own? And it's like, that's exactly how I feel. And that resonated so strongly. We had to talk about that. You mentioned something about activism and your work against the Kennecott mines. And, would you do it all again? And that's something that comes up in landmarks too. Every time we stand up or do something, again, if we say the only thing we're going to consider productive is if we stop this, or the only thing we're going to consider good is if we have this result, then we won't stand up at all. But what Rebecca, the narrator, calls it, she calls it kicking them in the shins. You might not be able to topple the giant, but you can keep kicking him in the shins. Just keep at it. And even the action camp that I won't give away the end of the novel, but most people who stand up to big oil, the end of that stand up doesn't really go well for individuals who do that. So I don't romanticize the end. But I do believe it's entirely hopeful, even as the action ends. The fact that they kicked a little harder, they pushed a little farther, they stopped a certain frack well site, actually 2 sites, from happening for 2 days. They stopped the progress for 2 days, is something to celebrate.
yes. Yes, beautiful. Well, I can't wait to read the book. April 16th is the release date. Bookshop.org. Wonderful resource. Thanks for explaining what they do. That's really positive.
Yeah. Yeah. They literally, and each and every person who orders from Bookshop can choose their own independent bookstore that they want proceeds to go to. Or you can just let Bookshop, dole out 10% to independent booksellers all over. But for instance, I have a relationship with a bookstore in Grand Rapids called Books and Mortar. And that's where on April 16, my pub day party will be at Books and Mortar in Grand Rapids from 6 to 8 p.m. if anybody's around, GR.
Okay.
And so I designate Books and Mortar as my bookshop, as the affiliate bookstore that I want any proceeds to go to. And of course, title track is the pre-order benefactor right now. So we'll run that from throughout March, right up until April 15. And
Thank you so much.
oh, you're welcome.
And we appreciate it. And we're going to earmark that for the Water Protectors Training Camp and make sure those dollars go toward empowering
Good.
water protectors of the future.
Good. Yep. Got to change that story. And Seth, I want to thank you too. We've had several conversations about this over the years, and I have always made it a point. I hope you've heard, to tell you, thank you for not being afraid to have your music be directly activist. Sometimes people are afraid, and it's one of those balancing acts where you decide, do I want to sell a lot and do something watered down, or do I want to be the strongest me that I can be? And, I always appreciate hearing your music and hearing what it asks me to think about and feel. And yeah, so kudos to you.
Thank you so much. That
You're
means so
welcome.
much. Yeah, we curate our audience a little bit with that choice, but I can't imagine doing it any other way.
Yeah, you're not gonna be singing and dancing the pop songs, I don't think. You can. You can do whatever you change to be, whatever direction you go in. But yeah.
Thank you. Well, I
You're
wanted to
welcome.
bring up in closing, some of our listeners might not know that you are Max Lockwood's mom.
Yes.
Max is a dear friend and a prominent Michigan musician. And that's how we first met. Max being a collaborator of mine, and I had the honor of co-producing his first solo album.
Right.
And contributing to some Big Duty Roo albums, and him playing bass with me. Thank you for being Max's mom and putting all that goodness in him and encouraging him to be an artist as well. And we're going to play one of Max's songs to take us out here in the outro.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, but in closing, Maryann, any final thoughts or calls to action or reflections about the book you'd like to share with our listeners?
I guess I just ask everybody to think about that idea that, there is no, activists aren't born. You don't even have to call yourself an activist. Just being connected, just showing up in any way that you can, because it matters. It matters so much. And then I'd just like to invite anybody, if you do end up pre-ordering landmarks and you want to come and have a conversation, check out my website, MaryannLesert.com, or my Facebook page. And I'll keep events around the area will be happening, April, May, June, beyond. Come and talk.
Wonderful. And if folks are interested in hosting an event, they can reach you through the website, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your work, Maryann. Thank you for supporting Title Track, and thank you for being a change accelerator in this world.
All right. Thanks, Seth.